Number 10, Dr. Donald Klein. Doctors have this sacred oath to put the patient's best interest at the forefront. But what happens when you've got someone with no sense of morality or remorse? Well, a lot of horrible stuff. Dr. Donald Klein was a pretty prolific fertility doctor back in the 1970s and 80s. In fact, he was the best in Indiana, which made couples turn to him when they struggled to conceive. He told his patients that he'd use the sperm of their husband for insemination, or alternatively, he'd use a sperm donor. One thing that he did make clear, though, was the fact that no sperm donor was ever used more than 3 times. However, decades later, Dr. Klein's patients' children started matching on 23andMe and Ancestry DNA as close relatives. And when they dug deeper into this plot, they discovered the harrowing truth that all of them were half-siblings. Dr. Klein had been using his own sperm to impregnate patients all along. At first, he denied the allegations, but dozens of DNA tests proved him wrong. When asked why he used his own sperm, Klein said that he was only trying to help desperate mothers and families. He then reassured his children that there were only 15 siblings in total, no more than that. But the truth eventually came out. Thanks to modern technology, it's been figured out that Dr. Klein may have fathered more than 94 children in total. But since there wasn't any law in Indiana until 2018 that would have made his actions a crime, he was let off the hook with a mere $500 fine. He was forced to surrender his medical license, but had already retired in 2009, and to this day, he continues to live freely with no charges. Number 9, John Leland Orr. In the late 1980s, California was ravaged by a swath of arsons, causing tens of millions of dollars in damage. Some of these fires were so bad that they resulted in multiple deaths. Now, at first, most people attributed them to short circuits. However, one firefighter who'd been at the site of pretty much all of these fires clapped back by saying that these fires were clearly started by one sinister individual. That firefighter was John Leland Orr, who'd made a name for himself over the years thanks to his quick intuition and ability to sniff out the root cause of fires. One thing that did keep popping up, though, was the fact that he was close to these incidents almost every single time, which got suspicious as the years went by. So after some investigation, it was discovered that Orr was the one behind all of those fires. Not only had he left fingerprints at these sites, but his methods of starting fires were also twisted. Apparently, he made an incendiary device by using a cigarette and 3 matches. The same device had also been used to start a ton of bushfires in the state of California. Oh, and he even wrote a whole book about his arson escapades, where he described his feelings under the guise of a fictional character. His motive? Pure, unadulterated pleasure. According to him, watching things burn felt better than sex. He also loved seeing his work get highlighted in the news, which is why he kept attributing these fires to arson. Orr was found guilty of destroying hundreds of homes and other property, yet showed zero emotional response to it. And, in the end, he was given 4 consecutive life sentences. Number 8, The Chameleon. In 1994, 13-year-old child Nicholas Barclay went missing from his neighborhood in San Antonio, Texas. Since he was a bit of a delinquent, his parents thought that he'd just run away for the day. As time went by, however, it soon became clear that there was something much darker at play here. They looked everywhere for him, and with the passing of the months, the hopes of the Barclay family ever seeing Nicholas dwindled. 3 years after their son's disappearance, the family received a jarring phone call saying that their son had been found in a remote village in Spain. He was identified through a photograph from the missing person registry. Nicholas returned home as a 16-year-old teenager, but it was clear something terrible had happened to him. He wasn't the same kid. His hair and eye color were different, which raised alarm bells in family members. He claimed that his kidnappers had dyed his hair and colored his eyes to make him unrecognizable. His new social behaviors could be written off as the effects of trauma. Not everyone settled for the new Nicholas. This was especially true for private investigator Charlie Parker, who had worked closely in filming the family after their reunion. He noted the inconsistencies in Barclay's behaviors and story. First, while Barclay described going through extremely scarring experiences, his behaviors reflected maturity rather than trauma. Second, it was highly unlikely that any kidnappers would go to the trouble of dyeing a child's hair to force them to blend in. It was also nearly impossible to alter any human's eye color. After the court ordered Barclay to submit his fingerprints and blood, the dark truth finally came to light. The boy wasn't Nicholas Barclay. Instead, it was 23-year-old Frederick Pierre Bourdin, who was a serial imposter from France and had assumed over 500 identities in his short life. Dubbed the Chameleon, Bourdin was a wanted man by Interpol and had targeted multiple other families by looking like their missing kid thanks to his thin frame and childish features. For a short time, Bourdin got a free place to sleep, food to eat, and a family that wasn't his. For his victims, however, it was nothing short of harrowing. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Number 7. Warren Jeffs. Born from a family of a polygamist religious group, FLDS, in 1955, Warren Jeffs' rise to power is truly fascinating and evil. The FLDS, or the Fundamental Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was already a pretty twisted community with its 7 joint leaders. However, due to the fact that he was born nearly 2 months premature and survived, people soon started calling him God's chosen one. Throughout his life, Jeffs continued to rise through the ranks of the FLDS and even ended up as the principal of the church's private school. From the outside, he was an unremarkable and bland man. But beneath the boring facade, there was something much more sinister. By 1986, Jeff's father, Rulon, was the sole leader of the church, also known as the Prophet. But despite having over a dozen older siblings, he was still considered the next in line. So, when Rulon suffered a debilitating stroke, Jeff became his spokesperson. When Rulon died, Jeff got all the power and his father's many wives. He soon controlled everything and started to change the rules of the church that members had been following for years. He chose what women were allowed to wear, he forced any male members to hand over their hard-earned money, and he started kicking people out he deemed a threat. He then went on to create an even more secluded temple called the Yearning for Zion Ranch, where only the chosen FLDS members were allowed to enter. There he'd marry girls as young as 12 years old and at some point even proclaimed himself to be a god. It was discovered that Jeffs was not only marrying underage girls to himself and other nasty old men, but he was also sexually abusing them. Because the FLDS is such a secluded community, the young girls didn't know any better. They simply did what was asked of them because they believed it was their duty given to them by God. Warren Jeffs has over 70 spiritual wives. Jeffs was ultimately convicted in Texas and sentenced to life in prison. Today, he still has thousands of followers and gives orders to them from his jail cell. Number 6. Luka Magnotta. Born on July 24, 1982 in Ontario, Canada, Luka Magnotta was always a troubled child. Not only did his mother often lock him and his siblings out of the house, but she'd also put his pet rabbits out in the cold so they'd freeze to death. After his father got diagnosed with schizophrenia and divorced his mother, Magnotta started staying with his grandmother. By 20, he was acting in adult movies and working as an escort. He even modeled for multiple magazines for a while, getting a ton of cosmetic surgeries in the process. In 2005, though, Magnotta was convicted of impersonation and fraud after he was caught buying $10,000 worth of gold with a fake credit card. In 2010, a video of someone suffocating kittens in a plastic bag went viral. A year later, another video popped up of the same person feeding kittens to a python. It wasn't clear until much later that the individual in the video was Luka. The worst was yet to come, though. On May 25, 2012, he posted an 11-minute clip entitled "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick." In the video, Luka is seen stabbing a naked man with an ice pick and a kitchen knife. The video also shows him dismembering the man and then using him for sexual acts and cannibalism. The man was Jun Lin, a Chinese student that gone missing a few days before the video. Initially, the video was labeled a fake, but when packages of body parts started turning up at political offices, and when Lin's head was found near a lake, well, that's when all the pieces came together. Eventually, Luka Magnotta was caught in a Berlin internet cafe by Interpol after he'd been on the run. And after a trial that lasted for many years, Magnotta was sentenced to life in prison. Number 5. Michael Peterson. In December 2001, police in Durham, North Carolina got a call from a man reporting that he'd found the lifeless body of his wife Kathleen at the bottom of the staircase in their home. This man was the fabled Michael Peterson. There were inconsistencies with the story. Peterson said his wife fell down the stairs, but things didn't add up. He soon became the prime suspect in his wife's death. Peterson claimed he was innocent, though. The trial went on for ages, with filmmakers capturing everything, including the strange evidence and insane correlations. For instance, this wasn't the first staircase-related death that had happened in the presence of Peterson. It was found out that in 1985, his first wife, Elizabeth Ratliff, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in their home in Germany. The last person that she'd seen before that? Peterson. Elizabeth suffered from seizures, and so it was believed she had one and fell down the stairs when no one was around. But when Peterson's new wife was also found dead on a staircase, an investigation was launched about the mysterious circumstances of her death. Elizabeth's body was exhumed for a second autopsy, and it was discovered that her death was indeed a homicide. Kathleen's body also had traces of owl feathers, which led to a theory about her being attacked by an owl that flew into the home, hitting her head and knocking her down the stairs. There's just no way Michael Peterson had two wives that both had unfortunate deaths on the stairs. After spending over a decade in prison, Peterson was finally released in 2017 on the basis of an Alford plea. An Alford plea is a guilty plea in which a defendant maintains their innocence but admits that the prosecution's evidence would likely result in a guilty verdict if brought to trial. Number 4. Dr. Death. Born into a working-class Manchester family in the mid-1940s, Dr. Harold Shipman was always a bright student and developed an interest in medicine after seeing his mother receive morphine injections to ease the pain of her lung cancer. By 1970, he had a medical degree from Leeds University and became a general practitioner. Only a few years later, though, it was discovered that he'd become addicted to opiate pethidine, as he'd written several fraudulent prescriptions for the drug, which forced him into rehabilitation. With that said, he was back as a general practitioner in no time and even regained his peers' respect. There was something fishy about him, though, when people started noticing unusually high cremation certificates that Shipman had signed off on. On top of that, there were also striking similarities in the recent deceased patients, as the majority were elderly women who were found sitting up and fully clothed. And in 1998, after another one of his patients was found dead only hours after Shipman's visit, the truth came to light. Not only had he changed her will to benefit him, but he also wrote that no autopsy was needed. Upon further investigation, it was found that she'd been given lethally high levels of diamorphine. It was soon after this that detectives found out that Shipman had been injecting his patients with diamorphine and changing their wills so that he inherited all their money and valuables. It's estimated that his murderous spree lasted for 26 years and that he killed almost 250 people, which earned him the title of Dr. Death. In 2000, Shipman was charged with 15 murders and sentenced to life without parole. He then took his life in his cell 4 years later. Number 3. Varg Vikernes. Known for his role in the Norwegian black metal band Mayhem, Varg Vikernes was already a pretty well-established musician by the time he turned 20. His upbringing was a bit questionable, though, because apparently his parents were racist Nazi sympathizers, so you get the gist. However, no one anticipated the hard left turn that his life would take only months into joining Mayhem. Varg was a pagan and believed that Scandinavia should return to traditional pagan roots, which led him to the infamous arson of the 12th century Fantoft Stave Church in Bergen, along with fellow musicians Øystein Aarseth and Bard Uthen. As a matter of fact, he even used the burnt church's photo as an album cover. A couple of years later, things took an even darker turn when he murdered his bandmate Aarseth by stabbing him 23 times. He claimed that the killing was in self-defense, but was sentenced to 21 years in prison, which, by the way, is Norway's maximum sentence. As the judge announced his sentence, Varg gave an infamous evil smile while looking at the camera. He was eventually released in 2009 after serving 14 years. These days, he runs a YouTube channel called Thulian Perspective, which is focused on politics, survival, and music, which is absolutely wild. Number 2. Peter Scully. Born in 1963 in Melbourne, Australia, Peter Scully led a pretty normal early life. He got married and had 2 children, like any other ordinary guy. At some point, however, something shifted and Scully left his family and moved to another city. He started off by running a fraud property scheme that earned him over $2.68 million at the cost of 20 investors. Shortly after, he got a teenage Malaysian girlfriend and pimped her out at suburban sex parties. According to one of his former associates, there was only one thing driving him: money. With that said, this was only the beginning, and after becoming the focus of a financial fraud investigation in 2009, he fled to the island of Mindanao in the Philippines, and there he built a twisted trafficking empire. Scully built an international pedophile ring based on videos of children being abused and tortured. He'd live stream these on the dark web for paying customers. He preyed on the weak and vulnerable and promised food and education. In one of his videos, Scully reportedly strangled and buried someone. He had plenty of customers too, as people would pay as much as $10,000 per view. Eventually though, Scully was caught in 2008 and sentenced to life in prison, but even then, he was seen smiling and displaying psychopathic behavior. Number 1. Louis Garavito. Born on January 25, 1957 in Genova, Colombia, Louis Garavito had a difficult childhood as he'd suffered abuse at the hands of his father and neighbors. This translated into a twisted mind, as in his teens he'd often kill birds for fun. The worst was yet to come, however, as his foray into alcoholism and depression turned him into a bona fide predator. Not only did he go on a killing spree which mainly targeted Colombian teenage boys, but he also assaulted them sexually. Apparently he'd used disguises to gain access to his unattended victims, most often posing as a monk or a priest, as he lured the boys with promises of money and a drink. According to reports, Garavito has killed over 200 boys, and that's not even counting the murders that he'd committed in other countries like Ecuador. He had plenty of adult victims as well. He did eventually confess to these crimes though, and was given an 835-year prison sentence for the murder of 189 people. Thanks for watching. Which one of these people scares you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time on The Bad Badger.